Friday, once a month. And we're usually talking about whatever issues are going on in the community. We like to go out there, find out what's going on, and report it here in the studio to our general audience. And so right now, the topic is Charlottesville, what happened. We're all trying to understand that and basically try to find a way to make sure it doesn't happen here and deal with the issues here while we're at it. So the racial divide and everything else. So that's what we're talking about today. And that's why the conversation is here.
She's standing. Oh, she's doing that. Okay.
All right. Well, good morning. My name is Keisha Ingram, and welcome to another episode of the Women's March at CSUMB Resistance TV. Many people believe that the horrendous display of the hate and the bigotry and the violence that took place in Charlottesville with the KKK supporters, the American Nazis, and the white supremacists finally showed not only white people, but just the world that the undeniable fact that racism is still alive and well in our country today. And now we feel like it's time for everyone, including the white community, to take a stand and step up and speak out and talk about these issues and the race and the structures and the institutions that have been built to kind of support this ideology. Today on this show, we have a panel of our friends from the Seaside City Council of California. We have the Village Project. We have the NAACP County Branch and CSUMB. We have the National Building Coalition Institute, the Direct Action Monterey Network, Indivisible Monterey Bay, and the ACLU, and also the Whites for Racial Equity. So I just want to kind of start off by going around to each of the panelists and having you introduce yourself and give a brief description of your organization. So we'll start on my right.
Hi, I'm Elena Loomis, and today I'm here representing Indivisible Monterey Bay. I'm also involved with one of the other organizations that's going to be mentioned, the National Coalition Building Institute.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm with the Direct Action Monterey Network.
I'm Stephen Goings. My spiritual name is Quasar. With a number of organizations, but today I'm representing the Personal Growth and Counseling Center and its National Coalition Building Institute chapter at CSUMB and the Monterey County chapter. National Coalition Building Institute is the purpose of that organization is to eliminate every form of discrimination, racism, oppression through the development of leadership teams.
My name is Kayla Jones, and I was elected to the Seaside City Council in November, so I'm representing the city of Seaside.
My name is Regina Mason, and I'm the Monterey County Branch NAACP current president, and I'm here representing the NAACP.
I'm Ann Jealous, and I'm here representing the Village Project in Seaside, although I also am a member of the National Coalition Building Institute and the NAACP.
Name is, Richard Moss. I'm here specifically representing Whites for Racial Equity. I also have been part of NCBI. I also work with an organization that takes delegations to Israel-Palestine to look at the conflict there from the ground.
And I'm Michelle Welsh, known to most of you as Mickey, and I am a longtime volunteer with the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, Monterey County chapter. I serve on its board and on the board of the ACLU of Northern California. The sole purpose of the ACLU is to protect and expand constitutional rights, including the 14th Amendment, requiring equal protection of the law, and the First Amendment, preserving our right to freedom of speech and assembly.
Good morning, everyone. Excuse me. My name is Shreya Shrestha. I am a lecturer at CSUMB, mostly in the Humanities and Communication and Global Studies departments. I received my PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California. I want to thank the organizers of this panel for inviting me so I can speak from my background as a scholar, but also as a community member. And I work with different community organizations in the area, like Direct Action Monterey Network, as well as Families of Color Monterey County.
So thank you again to all of our panelists. And so we're just going to start off with defining some of the terms, because when this Charlottesville situation was broadcasted to us, a lot of conversations began to take place in many different settings, and a lot of terminology has been put out there, but people really don't have the definition to what some of these things are. So we want to kind of start there by identifying what we are fighting and by answering the question, what is racism? And I first want to take the time to talk to Ms. Jealous to ask her about a book. You co-authored a book called Combined Destinies, Whites Sharing Grief About Racism. And it encouraged people to look at how white Americans have been hurt by the very ideology that their ancestors created. The book declared that unearned privilege is one of the factors contributing to the racial divide. So could you explain more about that concept?
Essentially, unearned privilege is privilege that you have, that you get for just being, that you haven't done anything to get. And in this country and in many countries, not all countries, but many, many countries, just being born white is a privilege, gives you enormous amount of privilege, whether you want it or not. It's given to you. So for example, I can just give you examples of that. If you are trying to get a loan for a house, or dealing with a bank in some way, or trying to buy a house in a certain neighborhood, if you are identified as white or Caucasian, you have an excellent chance of getting that house or that loan if your economic status is adequate. That's not true for people of color. If you're driving down the street, you can be pretty sure that you're not going to be picked on by a policeman unless you've really done something that's really evident, that you've run a red light or you've done something that is clearly against the law. That's a privilege that you have in this country that people of color do not have. If you are a white mom or dad and you go to bed at night, you're not worrying, as I do, and as most moms of black sons or sons who identify as black do, about their child being shot or racially profiled in some way. That's a privilege. If you go into a place of business or a restaurant or a hotel in most parts of the country, and certainly in most parts of this community, you can be pretty sure that you are going to see yourself reflected. That's not true for those of us who are of color. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on and on, but essentially unearned privilege means privilege that you get just by your own birth, by your own birthright. And was that clear?
Yep, it's very clear.
I could talk for hours.
Anyone else?
I asked her to please tell us. When we need to
It was
stop.
good, you know.
Okay.
So the next question that we want to ask is around what is the revitalized white nationalist movement, and what is that about? Is anyone on the panel?
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that for just a second. I think that the idea that what we saw in Charlottesville was a revitalization of the kinds of demonstrations of white supremacy that we looked at is not exactly accurate, in my opinion. I think that those of us who identify as white have been culturized to look at ourselves in having supremacy. I think that Anne spoke to the privilege that we enjoy. And I think that comes from the idea of supremacy that started way back in the time when slavery was instituted to replace the indentured white servant. As a result of that, whites had that sense of supremacy and superiority that has continued to today. So what I would say to that is that while we as white people hold on to and have and enjoy privilege from supremacy, that what we saw in Charlottesville was an extension, extrapolation of that same supremacy. So in order to address that in a certain way, then the group that I'm part of, Whites for Racial Equity, look at that specifically. And we pay attention personally what it means to be in having that privilege, what it means, how we've internalized supremacy, how it acts out in many, many different ways. And then we look at how to combat that with other groups and within ourselves.
I'll go ahead, Lauren.
Oh, well, I just also wanted to point out that I think what might be a little bit different about what we saw in Charlottesville, and I'm afraid we will continue to see, is the permission that our current president has given white folks who are, more on a fringe, to be more outspoken again. It's not that that's brand new, but it's revitalized in the sense that I believe people have been given permission to be at their most racist self and not feel any compunction about that. It's the equivalent, apparently, of civil rights workers. So I think that's where there's a little bit of a difference in the term that's used to describe those people who were attending that rally.
Oh, well, that's what I would have said. I appreciate that white supremacy, that the country was founded in white supremacy. That we exterminated and moved to the margins the original people of this country, that we brought people from a whole entire different continent to be here because they didn't know the terrain, and so they couldn't resist in the way that the original peoples here could resist. But I do think that I do also think that it's a resurgent movement, and and this is not the first time that it has been resurgent. If you ask most people when did African American men, I must say, when did they get the vote? When were they represented in Congress and state legislatures? Most people would tell you the 1960s. Not true. It was in the 1870s. Through the 1890s. And the reason why part of the reason why we were able to do that is because there were federal troops in the South preventing overt racism or the backlash. As soon as they removed those troops, the Ku Klux Klan began, and people were wiped out of those legislatures, so much so that it's completely forgotten in our memory. And we're in a time right now where that's happening again.
Stephen, I just want to say that it's not completely forgotten in all of our memories.
Right.
My family had congressmen and senators during Reconstruction. When the Klan came through Virginia and ended that, those men who were congressmen and senators were not able to vote. And their children were not able to vote, and their grandchildren were not able to vote until we were able to get the vote for all African Americans. So some of us remember because of family stories, or because we were taught when we were in school. And you're right, of course, largely it's forgotten. We have to be very careful that the history does not get written out of our textbooks, folks. It's really important.
I also think we've had a very, very long way to come from the abolition of slavery, which was in the 1860s, to now. And I don't think even the vision of the abolitionists then was full equality, which we now demand. And I do believe that part of the rage that's being expressed by white supremacists is the loss of a privilege they don't even realize they have because it is so inherent in their experience. And so they experience the loss of privilege as inequality and feel that something is being taken away. So there's rage on both sides, and we need I think, to be aware of it and acknowledge that, and somehow as a society grapple with that so that it can be healed.
And some of the rage, I think, comes from being able to speak out, right? And that right of free speech. And so I want to ask you more about that, the free speech cases from the early labor union movement and the civil rights era now being cited by the far right to assert their right to rally for white supremacy and advocate racism and religious intolerance. So can and should the government censor one type of speech and protect other speech based on its content in order to protect equality and mitigate the effects of racism?
Well, that is a really tough question that's before us right now. The old free speech cases, the modern era free speech cases arose protecting union organizers and leftists, such as socialists and communists, from being censored and being stopped and being heckled to the point of not being heard. So those cases really were protecting what would now be our allies in this struggle for equality. And those cases relied on the First Amendment and relied on the premise that the government has to be content neutral in its regulation of speech. And at the government, and with the ACLU work, it's all about the government. It's all about what's the role of the government in this. And the role of the government in situations like Charlotte and in situations throughout the country now is in the area of granting or denying permits, in the area of police protection or non-protection, in the area of stopping the speaker if the crowd gets out of control. And those are the links between where the government can oppress freedom of speech. The tricky part is where we're talking about applying those cases and those premises to speech that we absolutely abhor, to speech that in itself we find painful and harmful. And this is where a principled approach is absolutely necessary. Because if right now that speech is being censored, if that speech is not being allowed, if those people are not being permitted their right to assemble, the next time there's a switch in power and it's our side who aren't being allowed to speak and write and assemble, the same cases that we now have people advocating to change won't protect us either. And so it's a very, very tough issue, and frankly, I wanted it to be on the table. I don't want to discuss it for the rest of this meeting because it's really beyond the scope. But I do want to just point out one thing to you that Justice Brandeis said in Whitney versus California. Whitney was a socialist, and she was jailed and convicted for being a socialist and went to prison. The court upheld that. But Justice Brandeis, who wrote a concurring opinion, said this: "Our founders valued liberty both as an end and a means. They believed the secret of happiness and courage is the secret to liberty. They believed that freedom to think as you will and speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. They believed that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, and that public discussion is a political duty. This should be a fundamental principle of American government. They recognize the risk to all human institutions, but order cannot be secured merely through fear of punishment and its infraction, that it is hazardous for the government to discourage thought, hope, and imagination, that fear breeds repression, that repression breeds hate, that hate menaces a stable government, that the path of safety lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones." That was Justice Brandeis in 1927. So the point is that we have a long history of protecting the rights of the most bigoted, the most obnoxious, the most hurtful people to speak, because we need to know what these people are thinking, and we need to have that dialogue. So I hope that that is what we can help foster in our community, is a dialogue where let people who actually have those views come forward and engage with us so they can see how painful it is, how hurtful it is, and how harmful it is. So that's what I just wanted to put out there about free speech. And I could talk about it all day, just like Ann could talk.
Thank you. I think that was good. I mean, you got me. I was my mind. I was totally like, shut him down. Like, I don't want to hear that. But like you said, that's a great point. Unless I know what you're thinking, like how can I deal with that? How can I combat that if I don't know? So when I allow you to talk, allow people to tell you everything, and then you can then be strategic about your planning and then really nail down what it is that we're going to be dealing with.
And also, then you can claim a right to speak what you're thinking.
Right, right. So we're not denying their right. I'm also keeping my own.
That's
my own rights. Yeah. Yes,
Can I
ma'am.
ask a question? I wonder where the issue of violence and the weaponization of the folks that yes, they're guaranteed a right to free speech, but when they bring weapons that apparently were loaded and also, they came with billy club kinds of tools, where does that line get drawn? Is that free speech carrying a weapon, or?
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
I also teach constitutional law at Monterey College of Law, so I teach this stuff. Violence and advocacy of violence is incitement, and it is not protected speech. It falls outside of protected speech, according to our Supreme Court. And so if someone plans to come to a rally with loaded guns and to advocate for violence, that may well constitute incitement, which then allows the government to stop that behavior. It even allows the government to stop that speech if it's going to advocate for immediate present violent conduct. And that's why you see sometimes in the permit process, like the one at Chrissy Field, they weren't to bring any weapons, they weren't to bring any guns, they weren't to bring any clubs or anything of that nature, for the very reason that the government is allowed to issue reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions to protect safety. So that's a good question. I'm glad you answered it, because violence is not protected. They cross out of protection into unprotected speech when they go there.
Can I feel like we're being exceedingly polite at the moment. And and the organization that I represent has a lot of those attitudes, which I think work when it comes to doing the personal work of intervening with someone so that they will understand if they're rational
Right.
and want some sort of equality. But when we're talking about white supremacy, not merely white privilege. There's a difference between white supremacy and white privilege. White privilege is like a byproduct, and now it's like, because white supremacy has succeeded so well, you can have a white privilege that you're completely unconscious about. But white supremacy is not about fairness. It's not about dialogue. It's about one group holding themselves up and holding everyone down. So where there may be restrictions in terms of what the government can do, because we need the government to be fair to all. It's but as citizens, we certainly have the right to oppose this hateful ideology and oppose it very vigorously.
Just wanted to piggyback, since I work in government, I asked our city manager what Seaside would do if someone came and wanted to submit a permit to have one of these rallies. And because I view holding a Nazi flag as inciting violence, you're promoting genocide. They want people of color eradicated. So how is that not violent? Like, how do we protect that right? They're not living in the realm of reality. They're not rational. And I don't feel like allowing them to, chant blood and soil and to wear Nazi regalia. I don't I don't see how that's something that we should respect or protect. So what I can say from the city is that if someone did come and submit a permit, we would take this all the way up to the Attorney General of the state. And I would definitely make sure that we got their input before anything was allowed in Seaside. And if it was, I would be the first one holding protest signs against this. So that's where I'm coming from.
I think the operative word is peaceful assimilation of American citizenry. And we want to hear what all people have to say, but when you bring in violence, then that is the problem. So our speech should not be suppressed or oppressed because of one ideology over the other. And the NAACP even invited at our 108th convention this past July in Baltimore, Donald Trump to speak, and he declined. But yeah, I think that we believe in the NAACP in civil rights, and that means the rights of all people. And so we'll talk further in some of the other dialogue down the road.
So I think, during all of that, I think, and Stephen had alluded to some other questions that I had about the definitions of privilege versus supremacy, and kind of cleared that up for us. But there's also this thing of unconscious bias that we see, or this implicit sort of bias. Any of our panelists care to speak towards that? What is unconscious bias?
I'll say a little bit. If you grow up with unearned privilege, then you feel, and you're not even conscious of it, and you're not processing it, you're not doing anything with it, you're just walking around having your life in the midst of all of that, then you are conditioned by the society to believe that you are better than other people. And out of that comes a bias against other people that may be unconscious. It may be, one of the things that we learned with the anthology that we put together with stories from white people who are talking about how they, why they feel shame now about something that happened long, long ago, or why they feel badly about being silenced. It was clear that they grew up being conditioned to be that way without even recognizing it, because the conditioning starts very, very early. It can sometimes start immediately after birth with the baby being underneath of adult conversations. And bias is taught, so, but not talked about. So I think that's a part of it.
Yeah, and there's a whole body of research that's being done right now around this very subject. And a good example of it is in sentencing. When juries, they've done research that found that juries would sentence darker-skinned African Americans to harsher sentences, and that is an example of, and you can look at it in our criminal justice system and other systems that exist in this country, whether it's the educational system or the hospital system. Just look at the disparities that exist, and those are people making decisions about others that they may not think that they're biased, but their actions demonstrate that they are oppressing people, particularly people of color and African Americans.
It's an unconscious kind of a movement. They may not even recognize that they're doing that, or stop and think about it. Oh, I moved across the street from this person who's walking down the street. Why did I do that? Right?
Even though
And
it's
then
so
tracking it back to, oh, well, if that person had been, the white, and I'm white, and that person was white, maybe I wouldn't have crossed the street. Or if that person were female and not male, and oh my God, if it's black man, then I'm really going to cross the street, right? Or close my car window, or pull my purse on the other side of the chair, or move away. Pay attention. All we have to do is notice yourself and your own actions and stop and think about them. And then the bias becomes conscious. And then you can make a decision about, for yourself, if you want to act on that or not. It's really all we're, that's really, it's like a personal development class that you can take yourself through just by paying attention to what you do and then stopping and thinking about, why did I do that? Oh, because my mother said this when I was 6. Or I met this one human being who treated me badly, and oh my goodness, every single millions of others that look like that person gotta be bad. You see, that's garbage. It's garbage.
Yeah, the NAACP also has a youth council, and we also have the benefit of having many, well, it's really not a benefit, but we have many cases before us right now that have countless examples of implicit bias and unconscious bias. And an example is when a group of students on a high school campus assemble, and they happen to be African American, and they wear hip hop garb, and they feel targeted by school officials and authorities. And when that same peer group of Caucasians assemble, they're not targeted. So another example is the girls basketball team at one of the high schools. Their parents have to provide transportation to the games, whereas on the white girls who are playing softball, they get to have the school district transportation provided to them. So those are just a couple of examples.
I wanted to just also say that Whites for Racial Equity as a group pays attention to these unconscious biases. We pay attention to how we can increase our understanding of them. I don't know how much louder I can be, but
Move that closer.
the other thing that I would like to say around these unconscious biases is that they promote microaggressions that people of color feel every single day. So for us as white people, be able to pay attention to where our biases, our unconscious biases play out, and then we can see how people of color begin to experience our unconscious bias through microaggressions. We can interrupt that. That's another thing that we as a group will do. So we pay attention to personally what our unconscious biases are, how they relate to the wider environment and wider issues around racism, where our racism lives within us, where our supremacy lives within us, how to counter that. And it isn't just a group of us white people talking about it. We actually go out into the community and work with other groups like the Village Project and the NAACP in order to continue to engage and follow people of color's leadership.
One of the
I have
things,
to add,
go ahead.
just one little sentence, that all of that you're doing is helpful to you as well as to people of color.
Exactly.
Okay, you are in fact increasing your own humanity,
Exactly.
your own spiritual growth,
Connections.
your own connections across cultural lines, ability to do that,
Right.
so that you're not so isolated and you're not living in a sea of ignorance in your brain. So all of that helps everybody.
And it means that our conversations, are not difficult, or not that difficult. We have tools in order to move forward in these conversations.
I'm just hoping that the conversations are going into the white communities, right? Because I think that, I think what Stephen mentioned earlier, it's a difference between speaking to people who are rational. Like, they're not going to take it from me and talk about microaggressions. They have to hear it from someone else who's able to kind of articulate that to them,
Exactly.
who looks like them. And I'm hoping that's what's being really done, because these like you said, understanding your own biases, what you're doing to affect me. And if you're a supremacist, they don't care about really how they affect me and affect anybody else. And so I think, how to deal with that sort of issue. And did you want to speak to that? Sure, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to connect, like, why is there unconscious bias? Or why are there the particular types of unconscious, I mean, as human beings, we have unconscious bias.
Yeah.
But why does it play out the way that it plays out? I think that and one of the things that I like about the work of the NCBI and the Personal Growth and Counseling Center is we hook it up to externalized and internalized oppression. So if you have a narrative about a people, so you have a narrative about black people that they're dangerous.
Right.
You know, there's the criminalization of black people, and that is what's, you know, or a narrative about women that they're weak, or that they're the secondary sex, or the narrative about LGBT people that they're somehow antithetical to religion.
Right.
Well, all of that is what's floating in the air, and that all of that is what gets discussed so much, and that is the source of the particular types of unconscious biases that we have. So, which is why it's always so important. It's never enough to deal with these issues on one side.
Right.
You have to deal with it in terms of, you know, it is there's some personal work to be done, but there's also structural work to be done. And what is so pernicious about what's going on, and why some of us are so frightened about what's happening in the country now, that we have, for, I don't know, maybe the last 30 years, it has become unnice to talk about racism and your biases openly. So that has been suppressed in a certain way. With the lid coming off of it, as that becomes like, as white supremacists are trying to reclaim their rights to be racist publicly, that is going to, much more of that horrific opinion is going to be out in the open, which is going to create in all sorts of people even more, like, it's like we're losing the war in terms of that. That's one part of the reason why it needs to be so challenged, because we don't want to go back to, there are lots of people who are on the edges. You know, they could fall either way.
So I just want to say that Ida Bell Wells Barnett, one of the founding members of the NAACP back in 1909, talked about this very subject. It's rebranded as a different name, implicit bias, but lynchings were happening all over the country of black people. So this is nothing new. It's been happening since slavery. So,
Right.
I just want to add one thing, and that is the concept in the law that makes what Regina was talking about happening in the school illegal. And it's illegal because of the idea of intent versus impact. It doesn't matter if your bias is unconscious. If you are acting in a biased way in a setting like school or in a setting like employment, it is illegal, whether you know about it or not. So I'm glad this concept of unconscious bias has come forward for more discussion, because people used to say, well, I didn't mean it, so that makes it okay. Well, the fact that you didn't mean it does not make it okay, and it does not make it legal.
and the problem with someone bringing forward this in a legal kind of forum is it boils down to not having finances. And I think that because we're made aware of this, we're following through with some of it. But oftentimes parents that are living in underserved communities feel very afraid to bring anything forward, particularly if students are immigrants. And so I just want to say that there are so many examples of the situation happening all over this county and beyond that it's going under the radar, because oftentimes people will not bring it forward because of the fear.
And that's what I want to do now, is kind of shift that. I'm glad you brought that in, because we've been talking so much of the world view and the macro sort of problem. So I want to kind of focus in on this micro level here in Monterey County, and what does racism look like here? Is it here? Do we believe that it's here? Is it in our systems? Is it in our schools? Is it in our businesses?
It's really in our schools. I mean, one of the reason that the Village Project was created was because we heard that money was coming into the county, and we wanted it to be, some of it to be directed towards serving populations of people that have been unserved or underserved in this county, and that essentially meant black people, brown people, yellow people, red people, everybody who was not the privileged color, and white people who had no money. So the Village Project was established to work with families with mental health issues, emotional issues, family dysfunction issues, and we discovered that the children in those families, of course, were falling through the cracks in school. And so there was an after-school program established to help these kids not only with tutoring and with after school with homework, but also to broaden their worlds, because there are many, many children in this county who haven't been out of their neighborhood hardly, and then they have parents who are afraid to go to Carmel, afraid to walk the beaches. I mean, just there's a lot of emotional distress based on racial, on actually de facto segregation. So, yes, am I answering your question?
You are.
I have a lot of feelings about all that.
Can I answer? I just recently retired from 30 years of working in education, and one of the things I did do was work with NCBI at 2 different high schools, and they were very different high schools, and you know, I think one of the key things, people always diminish the money aspect of education and say, oh, we just throw money at it and it doesn't matter. Well, I'm here to tell you it does matter. At one school, which was a very mixed school, the majority of students were students of color. If students were taking, just as an example, the SAT test, they paid for it, unless they were able to get a waiver, and those are not that easy to get. There's paperwork that needs to be filled out. At the other school, where approximately twice as much money was spent per student, the school paid for every student to take, for example, the AP exams. They paid to have SAT tutors. The students were able to leave a class and go to a tutoring session, or it was provided on the weekends. And at that school that was, I'm going to guess, 85% white and relatively wealthy, the students of color would, in some ways, kind of want to hide. They didn't want to bring it up. So when I would do the work that NCBI does, allowing students to talk about incidents of racism at the high school that was predominantly students of color, kids would talk about it. They were upfront, they had stories to tell, and they told them. At the other school, oftentimes it would be the white kids that would talk about it. And the students of color would feel like, well, I just want to blend in, so I'm not going to say anything, even when they were given the opportunity. To me, it broke my heart. It honestly did. And if we could double the money that was spent at the other schools so that it was equal, then you can tell me that things are equal.
Right,
but
yeah.
when students aren't given those opportunities that are equivalent, and then the other thing is, parents with money can pay for a tutor to get. So I mean, right there,
That's the
there's all
privilege.
these levels. I did it for my children. I paid for them to go to a tutor to
Right.
improve their SAT scores.
Yeah.
If you're a family that's struggling, you don't have the money to do that. You're going to hope that the school is providing it. Anyway, I could go on and on about the school system and the inequities.
In
They are
terms,
there.
yeah, in terms of what racism looks like in Monterey County, it is everywhere from the child welfare system. When you look at the disproportionality studies that were done of the overrepresentation of children of color, particularly African Americans, who are a very small number in Monterey County, in San Francisco, all over the 58 states in California and beyond, there are disproportionate numbers of people. Everything that's negatively happening happens to African Americans at a disproportionate number as opposed to their white counterparts and the Latino population. However, it is about finances, it's about economics, it's about having someone get a job where they can compete in the economy, live anywhere on the peninsula that they'd like to live. And oftentimes people that are at the top making those decisions are people that don't know anything about the cultural congruent needs of their constituents, and that is a huge problem. So I just want to put out there that Monterey County has a long way to go in terms of parity for ethnic minorities, in particular African Americans, that you just look at the data, whether it's healthcare disparities, whether it is the engagement with the criminal justice system, both the adult and the juvenile systems. So if you just go and do your research, there's a website called kidsdata.org, and in 2013, I think there were somewhere around 41.7 African Americans children that were, or students that were 18 and 17 and below that had felonies in Monterey County. So I think that people that live in their cocoons and they are living their life because they have money to go to theater, they have money to pay their bills, they live in a great environment. Black people really are invisible to
And
many
one of
people.
the things we're finding in the Village Project is that so many of the children that we get are kids who were on their way to juvie, or were failing grades in school, being suspended, all of that. All it has taken is some attention. They come to the after-school program, people care about them, they pay attention to them, and these kids are getting A's and B's, and remember the last superintendent of schools who was shocked to see this child that was doing so well. That child had been in her office 3 times or something in the last year and was now really super succeeding. So we lose minds, and we lose contributions that could be made to this country as we lock up these kids, push them out of sight, or house them in ways that we don't even know they exist. And that happens here as well as in other parts of the country.
I wanted to add to that, like, I think what I hear Ms. Jealous and, forgive me, I don't remember her name.
Mason?
Yeah, Ms. Mason talking about are how in Monterey County, right, it's really important to kind of look at this like local picture of what's happening here, but that we are in no way sort of immune from these larger issues and trends that are happening nationally, right? And that's where I think that kind of question between how do we talk about and address things like forms of unconscious bias, right, that are extremely harmful, especially when they're carried by people in decision-making positions or positions of power, whether it's school teachers, social workers, let alone elected officials or police officers. But then to also understand that working, as Quasar was saying, or Stephen was saying, in in relation to then these more sort of structural and systemic forms of discrimination and racism, right? And so how is it that, on the one hand, we see individual bias, for example, on the part of some teachers in the public school system. We've also seen a shift in policies towards more punitive measures for students all across the country, right? So that the teacher's response to a misbehaving child has become much more punitive. And it's part of larger trends in terms of, policing and prisons. And that's why, a lot of people talk about, activists talk about things like the school to prison pipeline, right? As we have gotten more punitive in terms of our laws and policies towards criminals, we've also got much more punitive towards children in schools, and we've become much more punitive towards families who are struggling, right? So social workers are also operating within a system, right, where laws have been passed that say, and oftentimes, this is where people talk about, dog whistles, right? That the way that it's talked about is we have to protect these kids, right? We have to make sure that kids who are being abused by their parents have to be protected. Well, that's something that nearly all of us would agree, right? But then the way that it plays out in terms of policy then is to say, well, these kids are being harmed, and so we need to be harsher towards these parents. And make sure that no matter what happens, if a kid is going to be hurt in their home, we have to take them out immediately. But there isn't really enough awareness and discussion of the fact that most of the time in these cases where children are being removed, it's not because of abuse, it's because of this much more amorphous category of neglect, right? Which can mean you have 3 children living in one room instead of each child having their own room. That's more of a result of poverty than it is a willful desire for their parents to harm them. But because of these policies that have been passed that say, well, you have to, when you identify these kinds of problems, you have to act immediately, and there's a tendency towards removal, right? Then those families are, instead of giving perhaps those families access to affordable housing, right, the tendency is towards removal, and then you see this disproportionate issue in terms of things like child welfare. But you can see that in all these different areas, right? You can see it in education. Again, if we have schools and school boards and governments saying, you know what, the way that we need to have zero tolerance policies in our schools to protect our kids, even against things like bullying, right? Which again, a lot of us would say, well, that seems to make sense. Well, then what that means is that's where the individual bias comes in, right? Who's going to be perceived as a bully? Is it going to be a dark-skinned, black boy? Or is it going to be the white kid that he got into a shoving match with? He's going to be identified as the bully. We've already decided that zero tolerance policy is the path that we want to take, and so that child is going to face expulsion, right? And so there's a way in which unconscious bias, operates within these sort of larger systemic structures that we also have to be aware of, and are in many times much more difficult to see, right? But they're really, fundamental to understanding why we have the disparities that we have, both nationally and very clearly locally as well.
Yeah, and I can speak to this from a person who spent a career recently retired from the Monterey County child welfare system, and I was one of 4 African Americans out of grad school that really had to fight to get a job working as a social worker in Monterey County. I eventually fought and got a job working in Monterey County, but then when I went into that system and saw why they did not want someone who has a social justice, civil rights kind of background working there, it was alarming. Very, very alarming, because what they were doing to these families and these children it was really about poverty, many of these issues that were brought before the child welfare system. And so, having someone think outside the box and come up with a safety plan for a child doesn't mean sending the parent to court and taking the child from the parent for good. It means, how do you create a safety plan for a child so that that child can remain safely with their family? And so I saw many, many cases where families' culture was totally discounted. It was not even taken into consideration, and not just for African Americans, but for the majority of cases that came before the child welfare system. And I have to say that when they went into places in Carmel and Pebble Beach, who had all kinds of issues happening, also, they would stop you at the door and say, "I'm sorry, but you can't come in." And social workers were not even informing parents what their rights were and that kind of thing. So I think that as far as keeping people of color out of these systems does a grave harm to society in general, especially children who are so innocent in this whole thing.
And there is, and you alluded to something in your comment, and I want to kind of touch bases on that and talk about that. And that's the disparity of African American professionals here in the Monterey County. Because from my understanding, you have those people who, I'm a student here at CSUMB. I got my degree, I'm a graduate student, but then I'm sort of ousted. I cannot find a job here in this county, and I have to seek elsewhere. And then we leave, and then we don't have those supports in our county to fight for these children in other areas that need assistance. And so,
most of us have had to create our own jobs. I mean, essentially, I did a private practice and as a therapist for 30 years, but it was because that was the most viable way for me to earn a living, and stay here. So I think that we really do need to look at that as an issue. The African American population in Monterey County is smaller and smaller. Is it less than 3% now, I understand? I mean, we really aren't many. People act as though, they're going to walk into Seaside and Marina and get scared by all those black people. Well, they're not all black people there.
There we go again.
So we really do need to look at what's happening and how to make it possible for all kinds of people to live in this county, because we benefit from each other. It's the segregation, the separation, the apartheid that creates so much of the problem with racism.
Absolutely.
So
the NAACP here in Monterey County has been in existence in Monterey County for over 85 years. And we have a lot of leverage if we kind of thought about it in terms of how do we capitalize on the work that we have done historically, because our national association is 8 years. We have counties all up and down, 58 counties, and we have branches, college chapters, and youth councils in many of those counties in California. And so really one of the things that we're looking at right now is forming coalitions with our other branches across the state, because we all enjoy healthy relationships with our senators in Sacramento as well as our assemblymen. And if we use that leverage, and that's where our white allies can come to the table and help support changing legislation so that the NAACP in this country, here's a little booklet, and it's a federal policy priorities for the 115th Congress from 2017 to 2018. And it has everything that we're talking about here in terms of criminal justice, law enforcement, education, equal access, and so on and so forth. And it's not just in the counties in California, but we have branches across this country. And so we really need to start looking at ways in which we collaborate together across racial divides and with allies that are friendly toward the NAACP. I think one of the misconceptions that whites that look at themselves as superior think that the NAACP is a Black organization. However, 60 individuals founded the NAACP, and many of those 60 individuals were sons and daughters of slave-holding families, and 6 of those folks were African American. So, you know, we still have those people in our country that want to see, you know, fair and equitable distribution of resources, laws, and all of those kinds of things take place in this country. But the problem is so enormous that it is really going to take a lot of effort of us really strategically looking within our own communities. And of course, we know that all politics is local. And so we really need to look at it from a local and branch out and do that all across California as well as in the United States.
Can I speak a little bit to allies? So oftentimes the term ally is construed as looking at, for white people and in coalition with people of color, as, okay, we'll listen to you, we'll support you, we're right there for you, yeah, we'll do whatever we can, as opposed to actually putting our bodies on the line with people of color who are standing up for their rights and justice. And so I like to actually switch that term a little bit. So instead of being allies, we'll be co-conspirators with people of color, so that we are there as much as people of color in those communities, and to follow the lead of people of color. It is our responsibility to shift who we are and are thinking about as white people, what it means to have that unconscious bias, how it is and where we perpetrate microaggressions. It is our responsibility as white people, as the white society instituted this process. It is us personally to dismantle the power that the NAACP has and other organizations across the country. It's crucial that we join with them as co-conspirators.
And you will benefit.
And we will, you keep reminding me that. It's absolutely true. And I think that's true.
Yeah, right. Speaking of co-conspirators, we have always had co-conspirators in the civil rights movement. When you think of people like white Michigan housewife Viola Liuzzo, who traveled from Michigan when she saw what was happening on television to Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama, and was registering people to vote, and ended up being killed and murdered by the Ku Klux Klan during that time. And so we've always had, you know, I use the term allies, but co-conspirators by our side, shoulder to shoulder. And you can go back and look at your history and look at the footage of the civil rights movement. You'll see black, white together.
Just a quick aside, I would love, so the person that you just lifted up, the white person that you just lifted up, I would love, so now that we're in this conversation about getting rid of all these Confederate statues, like I would love for us to maybe we should put up a statue of her, because there have always been so many allies, and one of the things that disturbs me is this, that that for white people, it seems like they have no they have no models of identity of whiteness to go to when they want to be themselves, other than the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis when they want to do like us identity politics.
Great idea.
But they're not doing the work of lifting up the people who have been, there have always been co-conspirators. There have always been allies. Why don't you lift them up?
Because the government condemned so many of them. But that's an excellent idea. And I really, to put a monument to Viola, and they're innumerable people. She's just one. There's just innumerable people. I also would like to, when Fred and my husband and I were looking at the questions and he noticed Confederate monuments, he said, they really aren't Confederate, they're really supremacist. And that is really true. And I thought about that. There was a question that we might have gone into about whether we're erasing history by knocking down these monuments. There is, I cannot think of an argument that would support keeping monuments to slavery, monuments to Jim Crow in this country. There are books, history books, which should talk about those realities. But for children to pass by every day and look up and honor a man who was a master of Jim Crow laws in Baltimore, for example, it was a horrible, horrible experience for those of us who were African American growing up in that city, and also really a very mistaken, I think, message to white children, if this is a person to honor. But I think, Stephen, your idea of building other monuments, monuments to truth, monuments to equity, monuments to inclusion.
Yeah, I want to add to that just,
you go ahead.
Just really in the exact same vein. I can't remember the name now of the doctor, but there was a very powerful demonstration by a group of Black women, where I think part of Black Youth Project 100, in front of a statue of this doctor whose name I can't remember, who's largely recognized as sort of the father of gynecology, right? And the story of his sort of founding of the field, something that I learned about as an undergraduate myself in a women's studies course that resonated with me, and I continue to teach it now as a professor. But this doctor was, he was in the South, and so he did his experiments on the bodies of Black women who were enslaved, right? He was able to purchase the time and bodies, really, of slave women from the surrounding areas, because there were issues with their health that the slave owners themselves were interested in having addressed, right? Because it impeded their ability to reproduce, and in the sort of vile institution of slavery, that Black people were treated as property, and so the ability for Black women to reproduce and to create more property for the slave owner was essential. And so these women's bodies were used to do the kind of research that was seen as inappropriate to do on the bodies of white women, right? To look into their bodies, to use these devices. That's where the scalpel was developed, the type of scalpel that's used for the speculum was created, right?
An informed audience.
Not the scalpel, the speculum. This book, there's a really great book that actually just talks specifically about the speculum. But anyhow, and of course, a lot of the experimentation, obviously it was done against their will, but also a lot of the treatments were done, very painful treatments without anesthesia, because of these, very deeply embedded racist ideas that Black people are not as sensitive to pain, which actually continues to be a bias in the medical industry. But so it was, I think, very powerful for these women to stand in front of the statue in these like hospital gowns with like a pink dye representing blood spread on their bodies. And I think part of what they said, which I think is really powerful, is that let's get rid of this guy's statue and put statues up to the 3 slave women who were experimented on for years, right? And I think that's where it's about certainly honoring allies, but also understanding, right, that it's not just that this man was someone who participated in the institution of slavery, who was a slave owner himself, this doctor, but that the very medical institution from which, that is the basis still for the health of people who have, vaginas and ovaries and those organs, right, that type of science and health is based on the work of this man and the bodies of these women. And so making sure that we understand how deeply embedded, and that's when we talk about like white supremacy as something systemic, as something institutional, as Quasar was saying at the beginning, as part of the founding of this country. We would not have gynecology as we know it without what happened. So that can help, so we need to think about that, right? That it's not just about denouncing this figure. That's easy enough, but we're still living with I hesitate to call it benefits, but the realities of all of that science, all of that research are very much a present part of our lives every single day, right? Because all of us were born from somebody who had a vagina, right? And so in that sense, we can't discount that. And so I think that was a really powerful message to me that, it's not just about getting rid of the doctor, it's about acknowledging the people who's, and most people don't know anything about these three women, right? And so I think that was a really, I just wanted to speak to that because that really struck me and kind of is in the same vein of what you were saying.
I want to say one thing about statues, then I want to respond to Quasar. The thing about statues is the government, on government property, decides what statues to put up and what statues to leave up. And the government has the right to do that. That's in the 10 Commandments cases. The government has the right to put up the 10 Commandments because it's considered government speech. Well, interestingly, that means it becomes a political question. And that means who has power in politics? We do. So that means you can lobby to have these statues removed. You can legislate to have these statues removed. It's a political question when it's on government property. If it's on private property, it becomes a free speech for that private property owner, but most of these statues are on public property. And the only thing I want to say is I have to disagree with Quasar that the only images for identifying with being white are supremacists and bigots. I certainly hope you're wrong about that.
I hope so too.
Because my heroes as white people have been those who worked for civil liberties, for those who worked for protection, of equal protection under the Constitution for everybody. We have our white heroes, and we should honor them as well as our people of color who are our heroes. So I usually agree with you.
I'm not actually sure that we're having a disagreement. What I'm saying is I don't believe, that may be true for you individually, but I don't think I don't think that your average white person, when that thinks that, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think your average white person, when they, first of all, I think most white people don't think of their whiteness in the first place. And the only place where they do think of it, I think mostly is with the Ku Klux Klan and the neo-Nazis. So there's not an organization. Perhaps Whites for Racial Equity will change that. That's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that it exists, because finally we have some white people thinking about themselves not as co-conspirators or only as co-conspirators, but what is their own work to be done within themselves to dismantle white supremacy. But part of that, I really believe, is forwarding these positive white images so that your average person who is living in a much more multicultural world, and so many students at CSUMB, when we have these multicultural conversations, most of the white people will say, "Oh, I don't have a culture." And I hear this all the time, so they always feel as though they never seem to think that they are one among the many cultures. They always seem to think it's everybody else are the multicultural people, and we're in opposition to that. And I think part of it is the work hasn't been done to promote your heroes, as you're saying.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I would say in response to that, there's a certain as I was thinking about coming here today, I started looking on the internet and looking at white supremacist groups, and also looking at there are groups in this country that work to help people who are looking to get out of hate groups, and to what that looks like. And when I listen to some of these people talk, some of the people who had removed themselves from their hate group, whatever it might have been, whether it be Nazi, KKK, or white nationalists, which is to me a more accurate term rather than white supremacist, because I think that universally white people have that supremacy in them. So looking at the extreme white nationalists makes more sense to me personally. But what they would say is when they would hear diversity, for me, when I hear diversity, I see it as inclusion. For them, it means exclusion. And I think that having some deeper understanding of where these people are, how they got to where they are, and what their own individual, either their culture, whether it be Southern culture or Nazi culture early on growing up in their families, having some idea of where these people have been drawn into this. It is because of their feelings of exclusion, I think, and I also think that economically, many of them are disadvantaged economically. I think that's where the Republican establishment, and in particular the 45th, has tapped into. And I remember a quote from Banyan where he said, "Let the Democrats look at racism and identity politics. We will focus in on jobs and economy, and we will win every time." That's a really scary and also insightful comment. And it really means that the rest of us need to focus also on uplifting everybody and addressing those issues that are impactful to all of us.
Coming to this country means that you give up your culture.
That's what assimilation looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it was the whole American, the melting pot theory, whatever, which is kind of absurd to me, but it means that. And so almost everybody who's in this country, if you didn't come from Great Britain, you had a hard road, okay? And the Irish certainly had a hard time, the Polish had a hard time. I mean, there are all kinds of people who have white skin privilege, or their ancestors did, who came it was really rough. And then there is resentment, I think, in some of those groups and some of those humans about having to have such a rough road, and then seeing other people come in seemingly easy, not having to go through the same thing, or they go through the same struggle and they think, oh well, it doesn't matter because so did my ancestors have to go through it, but I turned my back on my culture. So we don't hear people talking about culture in terms of, where their great-great-grandmother came from or their grandfather came from. It's all in a pot called white, and that is part of the problem. I think if we.
I actually think.
Go ahead, Nikki.
Well, I actually think that some of the values that some of us as white people learned when we were children about our ancestors, mine were Irish, and the troubles they had and the fights they had, and my father was a union man and he organized in the labor unions. Some of those values are the same ones we're trying to foster here today. So I do think white people have those basic values. They just don't apply them to everybody. Some of us. And I would like to see us tap into that and be able to have all people see that the struggles that people of color are going through are the same painful struggles that their ancestors, their families, and sometimes their children are going through now. And I think if we make those links and those connections, that we will have some hope for our future.
I wanted to go back to the statue issue for just a minute. And I just read apparently a poll that I think it was like 60% of Americans think it's okay to leave them. And then when they broke it down, it was majority of white people thought it was okay, and African Americans thought it wasn't okay, but just the general. And what I wonder is if we put it to politicians, if they're the ones who in fact get to decide this, just imagine that you replace every single one of those Confederate generals and horrible people who operated on women with Adolf Hitler. Would you say yes? Because essentially, that's what they were. They were, killing people. They euthanized. They did experiments medically. That's what Hitler did. And I bet you 60-80% of Americans would say absolutely not. We're not going to have Hitler in our parks. But when we change it and say that it's this historical thing,
we say it's okay.
Uh-huh.
And I'm pretty sure in Germany, they have maintained their history. They are remembering the Holocaust. They don't forget it,
Right.
but they don't do it in a way that lionizes Hitler or his, generals.
Swastikas are illegal in Germany.
Yeah.
We don't even admit that we had a Holocaust. Whenever we talk about Holocaust, we're talking about Germany. We never talk about the Holocaust against the native peoples here. And I hate that phrase neo-Nazi applied in the Americas. I think it should be American Nazis because because I think it's a form of distancing.
Yeah, terminology is important. I totally agree. You need to move on.
Yes. I'm gonna go ahead and
Go ahead.
move us.
Yeah.
I think we could be here all day. Because I'm sitting up here like learning. I'm supposed to be moderating, but I'm up here like taking it all in. Like I don't want to, thank you for help. So far, really, we started off just defining, right, what these different terminologies are and what they have been since the Charlottesville thing has happened, and then we kind of talked about the role it plays in Monterey County, and now I'm just going to wrap it up by getting to the so what of it. So what now? We've defined it, we've identified it, so what are we going to do? And so I just want to let each person on the panel, just with their organization, talk about, and in their classrooms, what they're doing to sort of combat this issue. I'm going to start with Miss Sheree.
That's a really challenging question to start with.
We can come back. I can come back to you if you like.
Well, I mean, I think I think as an educator at the university level, I would say that actually one of the things that I'm most interested in is actually very explicitly talking about issues of more institutionalized and systemic discrimination and racism. I think that's a great, that there's so much that people do not realize and understand about how even if they individually do not feel any overt or recognizable racial animus towards anybody else, right? That still these systems of white supremacy are operating on a systemic level, and that they are benefiting from them, right? And that these systems are perpetuated. And so I think having conversations that help us understand that, right? So talking about things like, a term that activists use a lot is like if we talk about the issue of mass incarceration and policing in prisons, which thanks to the work of a lot of activists like the Black Lives Matter movement, people are starting to understand, we have a problem in this country with mass incarceration. But then I want to push them to think about things like what activists call the prison industrial complex, right? So that when we talk about, okay, there's a problem with the prison, it's not just a problem of the people in that building. It's not just a problem of the warden and the prison guards, that there's an entire sort of economy that has emerged around the maintenance of a very, very harsh and punitive prison system that is deeply embedded in racism, right? And so you have to think about politicians who tout tough on crime policies, right, as a way to get elected. You have to think about prison guard unions who are advocating for the rights of their workers. You have to, who are prison guards, right? You have to think about rural development organizations, right, that are saying, well, we have a community that's struggling and we need a way to get jobs, and so let's bring a prison here, right? You have to think, and I think a lot of students love to say it's private prisons, they're the problem, right? And they are a problem, but they're also a tiny, tiny percentage of who actually runs and operates and opens prisons. And so I think private prisons is something a lot of us go to because it seems like an easy fix. The problem is that people want to make money off of prisons by building them and running them. That's the problem. But the fact of the matter is there is a whole bunch of people who are profiting off of prisons. The people who send in the catering and the food, right? That's another group of people who are, if we start saying we want to change the prison system, we want to make it less punitive, they're going to say, wait a minute, that's like, I'm not interested, you have to think about those people too. And so I think one of my biggest efforts actually is to get students to think about things in this much broader, more systemic way, which is actually much more intimidating, right?
Yeah.
So that when we think about, most of us, when we think, how do we address an issue, we want it to be like, we just get something simple. Let's get rid of private prisons. Let's convince this one politician to listen to me and it'll be fine. Or if I get this one person elected, it'll be fine. It's not gonna be fine, right? That when you're talking about institutional and structural racism, you're talking about things that are very wide and very deep and involve a large number of people. And so it takes a long time, it takes broad-based social movements, and it takes very strategic issue-based organizing, right?
Thank
And
you.
so it takes all of those things, though. It also takes people getting pissed off and going in the streets, right? It takes all of those things because these are structural and systemic things, right? And so, but that's hard. It's hard to wrap.
It's hard to wrap up because there's so much.
Yeah. Oh, I had 2 minutes. Okay, so that's what I do. So that's what I do I try to do as an educator and also as an activist, right? I try to think about how do you, do whatever you need to do on an individuated level or on a more focused level, but to always look at that bigger picture and understand the bigger institution.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, I will be quick. I realize we need time for everybody else. The ACLU will continue to litigate. The ACLU is one of the primary litigators with more cases in the Supreme Court on constitutional issues than any other organization, and that is really a key part of what the ACLU does. Education, know your rights, presentations in the public sphere, but also a lot of education online and elsewhere. But also internally, the ACLU as an organization for the past many years has had a racial justice component, a racial justice project, and is doing work internally to be aware, as I sit on the boards of the ACLU, of every single choice point, considering the impact on the culture and race of the people affected by that decision. And so what I personally want to do here in the community for ACLU, and I'm also a life member of NAACP and work together frequently, is to continue to interact with each other. We can't stop. We can't say this one time happened and now it's over. It isn't. We have to show up. We have to come to these events and be involved. We have to speak up. We have to exercise our own rights to free speech. That way, the free speech that our opponents are exercising can be overcome with good speech. We have to work on ourselves. We have to do the unconscious bias work that everybody has talked about here today. And we have to keep up hope. And I'm going to echo what Abdi Sultani, the executive director of the ACLU, wrote just yesterday. What gives me hope? What gives me hope is you. You're here. You're taking your time to be here because you care. You care about our community. You care about our country. You care about yourselves. You care about your role in making the changes that need to be made. So what gives me hope? We do. Let's do it.
So the local organization, Whites for Racial Equity, is an organization that I hope everybody has an opportunity to take a look at our website. I'll say it, whitesforracialequity.org. Straight out, simple spell. It has a lot of resources on what you can do. It has a lot of resources on history. It has a lot of resources on books, movies. But not only do we have meetings on the second Saturday of every month, but we also have book clubs, film showings that delve into what racism looks like. The other component, I think, for what I appreciate about the organization is we do look at where this is kind of a new maybe phraseology for people, is the intersectionality of where we as an organization and as a people, as white people, intersect with other groups. Prime example, and I'll stop after this, is that I also work with Palestine-Israeli issues and for Palestinian justice, and we at the Frederiksen, Palestinian local justice advocates stood up with Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter stood with Palestinian justice activists. This is an international kind of thing, and that's the reality is that what we're dealing with here around racism is international. the oppression of the Palestinians is based on the racism that the Jews brought from Europe as their experience in Europe to that land, and that their oppression is based in that. So it is the intersectionality, it is a global issue, it is a way we locally can work intersecting with many different groups. So please visit the website and check it out a bit.
Thank you.
I want to share a little bit about the Village Project, which has been here for 9 years now, to help with the issue with the impact of racism. We're doing therapy with no-cost therapy for families and for individuals. And that is because most of the clients are people of color, and all of them have been impacted by racism. We're doing some healing work that helps them recuperate from that. Internalized oppression we haven't talked about here, but it's a very big thing, and essentially the definition is taking the attitudes, negative attitudes, the oppression that has been exerted on you by other people and believing those negative things about yourself and about your group. So that's has huge impact. It has all kinds of consequences that are horrible. And so we're dealing with that by not only in therapy, but also we've just gotten a grant that you may have read about in the Herald that is started a project called Imenyata, which briefly will bring children together on Saturdays to, in many ways, learn about the history of their ancestors in terms of the ancestors that came from Africa. So they will learn about the positive things about that continent, and also they will learn about themselves, and they will interact with other Black people who are good role models for them, and they're going to be reading and doing academics and doing all kinds of interesting things. But the main purpose is to change the self-concept, to heal the internalized oppression that they have already received, even that they're in grades kindergarten through 4th grade, so they're little children, and we're very hopeful about that project. We also have required parent classes, and so the parents come together and learn from each other, which also helps their self-esteem and helps them see parents in other groups, being with parents of other groups, because we do work with children of all races. The fundraisers bring all people from the community together, and sometimes it's the first time a white person here has gotten to sit beside a Black person at lunch and have a conversation in this community. What else are we doing? Oh, and the children are learning that they can be in an environment with kids from other groups without being bullied, and with adults who love them, who care for them, who pay attention to them, and to feel safe in a mixed race gathering, which for some of them is new. So that's some of what we've done.
Okay, so one thing the NAACP is currently doing is we believe that self-determination is important for all people. And so we're doing several different, we're coming up with several different strategies, and one of them is to look at the data that exists in Monterey County, from everything to, who are the judges on the bench? Are they all from the prosecutor's office? And why is the district attorney not running for re-election and no one running against any of the judges and the district attorney? who do we want to see on our school boards? Or do they have an ideology of oppressing children of color? A good example is these school resource officers. You don't see them in private schools or charter schools. So the NAACP right now in Monterey County is looking at data in all of the systems, and we need all of your help. The NAACP is a membership organization that has existed in this country. We're the boots on the ground from our national office. And so if you are not a member of the NAACP, we would like for you to become a member and stand by our side and help us in this effort. Because without bodies of people, a lot of our membership currently are elderly people. And so we're looking at millennials and anyone that wants to come that has anything that they can contribute to help with our research to make sure that we can make informed decisions in terms of a strategic plan, because we believe that fair distribution of all of our resources should go to all communities, and especially communities that have been systemically oppressed. So that's just one of the things that we're looking at. Broadening it, we're looking at collaborating with our NAACP branches throughout the state of California and in all of the 58 counties, so that we can influence legislation and policy at the state level and then on the national level. So that's just a couple of the things that we're doing.
Well, Seaside is working to address discrimination on all fronts, and we are the most diverse community on the peninsula, and we've had the most diverse electeds since we've been founded. If you walk into City Hall, you'll see mayors. We've had Black mayors, we've had white mayors, we've had Latino mayors. So we continue to try and address discrimination on all fronts. In June, we hosted the Peninsula's first Gay Pride Parade, which was a huge success.
Because of you.
I put forward the idea of Seaside becoming a sanctuary city in January, and less than 2 months later, we declared ourselves a sanctuary city. We declared sanctuary status. Also, I recognize, being a mother and being a low-income parent in Seaside, that it's really hard to attend meetings if you can't afford childcare. So I implemented free childcare at City Hall, where you can take your kids just down the hall into the room from council chambers, because the saying is, if you're not at the table, you're what's on the menu, and they need to be and they need to be a part of these important conversations. And speaking about the diversity of our electeds, I just want to touch on, if you know millennials that you think would be great in office, ask them to run. And they say you have to ask a woman 6 times to run before they'll consider it. And I believe that each generation brings forth new ideas and new social change. And the millennials today, I just want to briefly touch on the queer rights movement. You had, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s saying, we want gay marriage, we want equal rights. And then now you have millennials saying, we want trans rights, we want to talk about gender, we want to talk about what it means to be gender queer and gender fluid. So I think that we definitely need millennials in these decision-making positions, because we are what's going to bring forth that social change.
I want to, first of all, I want to acknowledge some folks. For you, of course, Kayla. You're one of the people who give me hope. I want to acknowledge, we've talked about NCBI, and obviously I'm representing NCBI. And Jealous is the person who brought NCBI to this peninsula, and Fred. Regina and Mel Mason are like the giants in the African American community. And we haven't heard much from this person over here, who is extremely radical and a dragon slayer. We need dragon slayers as well. But I also want to acknowledge, however, that this has been a primarily a binary conversation between blacks and whites. I mean, that's what's been most up in the room, and maybe it's because the inspiration is Charlottesville and the Confederacy. But white supremacy has affected for every nationality and every ethnicity, including whites. And it's important, and someone mentioned intersectionality, which I think is always important to bring up, because racists are sexists, are heterosexists, are, you know, so like all of those things go together. So like none of these systems of oppression can or should we ever talk about in isolation. So if you are working against white supremacy, then you must be working against homophobia. You must be working against sexism. And that's the reason why I like the work of NCBI so much, because it really talks about everyone understanding the ways that oppression affects all groups. And then the last thing I want to say is, well, I want to go back to the KKK thing, but all I want to say about my idea about white identity, there needs to be branding for white identity, a positive branding that is as powerful and as well known as the KKK or the neo-Nazis. And then I want to talk about resources. So one of the ways of helping other groups is resources. So I'm going to pass this out. This is a email sign-up sheet so that you can support our various organizations. I know that I'm also the college chapter advisor for the NAACP, and I try to send at least a couple of students to our national convention every year. But we should be sending 25 to 30 students every year. Now that is something that, so you can open your pocketbooks, you know, and, you know, saying that NAACP is a membership organization, it's $30 a year. So please sign up and just like support us in terms of actual material resources. I know Whites for, remind me of your name.
Racial equity.
Well, no, I mean Richard Moss? Right. Mentioned the fantastic website of Whites for Racial Equity, and it is marvelous, you know, all the things that they're doing. NAACP, I know, and some other organizations are struggling with their website. So I know that you've been able to do that so beautifully. Send some people over, if our president agrees, you know, to help us. So like if you have more resources and are able to build stuff like that, you know, look for your organizations that aren't here that could use that sort of support. I'll shut up.
Thank you.
So the Direct Action Monterey Network looks at, we do a lot of different projects, but regarding challenging white supremacy, we look at, I think, the most violent institutions that maintain white supremacy. So talking about the police, prisons, borders, and the military. And so if we take seriously the argument put forth by Michelle Alexander in the new Jim Crow, if the criminal justice system is the new modern iteration of the new Jim Crow, of the original Jim Crow, and the Jim Crow is kind of a reaction to the abolition of slavery, then we need to see ourselves as a kind of a contemporary modern abolitionist movement. And so our goal is to abolish these institutions, these incredibly violent, inherently white supremacist institutions. And so some of the projects that we do towards that end and to work on these issues is we do a lot of organizing with communities in the area who are experiencing police violence. So the Black Lives Matter group in Seaside and people in Salinas who just a few years ago experienced a wave of police shootings of unarmed Latino men. 4 were killed in 2014. Supporting communities who are challenging police violence, communities of color, and towards challenging the prison system, we support, we do work through the Anarchist Black Cross, which supports political prisoners, including a lot of former Black Panthers who are still in prison decades later, as well as people who have been facing repression for the kind of uprisings in places like Ferguson and Baltimore, where communities of color have resisted police violence there. Very, very powerful militant responses where people face a really serious repression. We also work with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, which is organizing people in prisons and they've organized hunger strikes and work stoppages. And they see the prison system as kind of modern plantations where people do work for very, very low pay, like cents an hour. And we all know about the racialized nature of prisons as well, of course. And we also have been involved with the recent organizing around the Rapid Response Network to respond to immigration raids, ICE raids in the area. So And we don't really do much around militarism because there's not much of an anti-war movement, but there are awesome groups in the area doing that. We try to support them as well, like the Peace Center and Peace Coalition, of course, when we can. So those are, we kind of look at, like I said, the kind of most violent institutions that maintain white supremacy. And of course, supporting groups who do other things around schools and other things as well. So those are the kind of projects we're working on. If you want to get more information or get involved, you can check out our website, the Direct Action Monterey Network.wordpress.com.
You're doing the work.
Well, before I talk about the group I'm involved with, I just want to thank Jackie for organizing. Wonderful moderator, and I just feel so privileged. I feel privileged to be on a panel with these folks. I'm overwhelmed and overcome by the brilliance here, but I'll offer what I have. I'm part of an organization that's new. Indivisible Monterey Bay came out of a national movement called Indivisible, which you may have heard about. The main goal is to get folks elected who are going to stand up against racism, against sexism, against homophobia, against everything that the current administration stands for. And each local group decides how they want to focus. And actually in Monterey County, there are probably 10 other indivisible groups with slightly different names, all of them part of Indivisible. And some of the things that we've done is collaborate with other groups. We collaborated with Jackie a couple months ago to put on a free speech rally, which was very successful, though it was organized, I think, in less than a week. We collaborated with Unite Here to put on a rally in support of the union work that's being done in the county. We support the Immigration Task Force, and I really am looking forward to figuring out a way to collaborate or resist with the NAACP on the legislation that you mentioned, Regina, because that's our primary focus, is working through our political leaders. And then I want to put out that there are 2 events coming up that aren't actually indivisible groups, but they're groups that I'm also involved with, and that is we have a tentative date for a panel discussion about what's been going on since the election of, I like to call him 45, how that's impacted folks on September 23rd. Probably we're most likely at the John Steinbeck Library at 2 o'clock. But if you put your name on that email list, I will make sure that you get the details. And then going to what Kayla said, I'm also a member of the Monterey County Democratic Central Committee, and we are organizing a candidate forum on October 7th, the location to be determined, and Kayla has already offered to be one of our panelists. So you're the first to hear that. And the idea is to recruit people, millennials, young people, old people, people that have been underrepresented to run for any of the offices, especially our local offices. Every school board is going to be having their election in 2018, with the exception of North Monterey County, which is having theirs this November. So there's going to be a lot of seats to be filled, and we need activists to fill those seats. So if you put your name on that, I'll get you the details, but it's October 7th from 10 to noon, location to be determined. So thank you.
So just want to thank everybody on the panel today for just educating us on what's happening here in the country and locally. And so right now we have about 10 to 15 minutes, and we're just going to open it up for any audience questions. Okay, and so Jackie's going to...
All right, before you begin, I have a question of my own. I'm not sure if any of the panelists answered this question, but I want to ask first Mickey and then Ms. Regina to follow up. When someone tries to address the lack of resources in the African American community, why is the answer always often, oh, the African American churches will take care of that? I hear that so much, and I want to know, what do you mean by that?
I have no idea what they mean by that. The churches, as we all know, there's separation of church and state. So for the state, if you're talking about government agencies, to say we're not going to do that, that's up to the churches. is a total cop-out of the government's responsibility regarding the resources they have under their control. So I think an appropriate response would be the churches are doing separate and different things as churches. I'm talking to you as a government official, and I'm telling you that the resources you have are not being allocated fairly, because it is a total diversion and non-response to say we're leaving it to the churches.
I don't know who these people are that are saying that, what their demographics are, but I do believe it's a stereotype to allow, and it's also, I concur with what Mickey says, it's a cop-out. We know that for years, the African American communities all over this country have been underserved in terms of an equal distribution of resources, financial resources. And so oftentimes you'll have resources coming into our communities by other people, agencies that are totally not aware of the cultural needs of the African American community. And I do think that it is a form of supremacy as well. But I think that just historically, we know that the African American community is not receiving its share of resources. And trying to group all of the African Americans together is inappropriate also. We believe that culturally congruent services is paramount to positive outcomes, as is evidenced by the body of research that's out there. And so I think that whoever these people are that are saying that may be stereotyping the African American community, but also on the other hand, the church in the African American community has been the fabric of the African American community. The NAACP in many of the southern states especially, and throughout California, have presidents that are of their local branches that are pastors of churches. One is our famous Brown in Amos Brown at Third Baptist in San Francisco, who was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s youth. And so I think that maybe whoever these people are, I don't know who they are that are saying that, but I do think that if they're looking at it from a cultural perspective, the church has always been in the African American community and one of the pillars in our community, one place that we go to for resources sometimes because we can't get them anywhere else. And so I think that that's probably my...
That's right. In many cities, it's been a social center. Certainly doing it.
Right.
So I'm going to start by passing the mic this way, and I'm sorry. So who had their hand raised? Okay. And if we go over, don't worry about it. This is what it's about.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Wave Street Studios for this great venue. This is wonderful. I hope there's lots more. I just feel like we need to consider the kind of slightly nationalistic view of racism, that it's beyond our borders of this country, in our behavior as a country, that racism is absolutely essential to the maintenance of the capitalist system that's maintained with the kind of violence that Michael was referencing. And it demands the taking of resources from undeveloped nations to stock the shelves for Walmart and all of our stores by using exploited labor, which requires violence to get the resources that we need for our sustainable electric cars, our solar panels that are made in prisons with, for pennies on the dollar. All of this, it's the capitalistic system. And what happens, if this leads us to end up supporting political candidates who say all the right things, and they speak really nicely. Everybody but Trump, manages to actually kind of be civil in their speech about racism, and he was just without boundaries. And the people that speak the nice rhetoric are the same people that are inflicting horrors and obliteration on those that they clearly consider inferiors. As with the last election, we had no choice at all. We had a woman that was responsible for helping found the racist prison systems and destroying the safety net and bombing Yemen and Libya and Syria and using comments like super predator and we're supposed to vote for that as some alternative. We've got, we have to get beyond this party, the parties, and thinking that anybody but Trump will be okay. What should we do as a people to try to change this system? It's not just a Democratic Republican Party problem that we have, and it's too often just if we have some other politician of a different party, we're going to be fine. And we're just not. So we really need to think beyond the parties. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. I'm going to go from this way to Ms. Helen, and then Sylvia, and then way over there. Meta can help me out. She'll do that side.
Oh, I gotta move over?
Oh, no, we're gonna follow you. That's how good we are. Yes.
My name is Vincent Raj. I came here today to be edified and educated, and I have been both edified and educated a lot. So I want to thank the folks who brought us together this morning, especially those. And I have a question for Angelus, to educate me a little. I think you said, and I understood you to say, that in your family, you had family members who served as legislators. Was that pre-Civil War?
It was during the Reconstruction period, after the Civil War. In the South, black people could vote, and black people could be elected. And so yes, they were elected after the Civil War, but then after the period of Reconstruction, which is a very important historical period people need to know about, I think, the Klan came through as a major American terrorist group in the country at the time, and essentially took over the government of the southern states. So my family came from Virginia, so they took over the government in Virginia and stopped all voting rights for people who had African heritage.
So your voting rights were taken away?
Voting rights were taken
legally
away.
By the Southern
Yes, the people were chased out of their offices. Yeah, so essentially they were, yeah.
I should point out one thing. It was only men who could vote. Women of no race
Yes.
could vote until 1928.
That's right. So these people were male.
I wasn't born in this country nor raised, so that's
Yeah.
where my ignorance
no,
comes
but-
from.
yeah, you should
The
do-
last one is a suggestion to Mickey Welsh, a good friend of mine. Mickey, have you considered running for district attorney?
I can answer that very simply. If I had ever, in my entire 39 years of practicing law, tried a criminal case, I might consider it. But I have zero experience with criminal law, I'm sorry to say, because somebody needs to step up and run.
Could you take a class?
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Heck, maybe I'll try it. Thank you, Vincent.
My question is for the panelists who are of color, particularly. I've heard, I often hear that you school your children on how to behave around whites. I recently learned that I should touch an African American first because they're taught not to touch white people first. Can you give me some more ideas on, can you school me about what you school your children on so I can be more enlightened? Thank you.
I just want to address that. For all people, I think you need to ask permission to touch.
Good point, Ann. Good point.
What color the person is. So start
Right.
there.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And then whatever, I don't know, if you guys got racial things.
Well, certainly with law enforcement, I've always taught my son, if he's walking with a group of friends, do not put his hands in his pocket. Don't say anything, remain silent.
Yes, and the same thing, my son just went back to school. He's at Tuskegee University in Alabama. And, yeah, I know, some of the places. And I recently received in a book, in
in a black book club that I'm in, a card from the ACLU about know your rights. When you're walking, when you're pulled over, or whatever, these are your rights. And so we definitely school our children definitely on knowing your rights, because it's terrifying to be driving, even for myself, down the road and you see those lights sort of go behind you. My own child was coming from prom here in this area and got pulled over, and a girl by herself and terrified, came home shaken, very scared, just because of what we've seen in the news and what we try to tell them. And we have to be very open and very honest and show them the atrocities, the things that are happening to our kids. And yes, and definitely the touching piece. I'm originally from Texas, and I come here and I noticed that the West Coast, is a different ball game. And you guys love those animals, your pets and stuff. And people ask permission to touch your pet, but yet they come up to me and just want to go for my hair or something like that. So, I find that pets have more privilege, right? than me. So yes, there are these things that we teach our kids. Those things that we have to tell them, not only for themselves and their own self-pride, but for their safety as well.
I wanted to answer. I don't know where she is.
Over here.
Okay. Well, beyond just talking to your kids about how to interact with law enforcement and with school officials, I think a lot of the conversations we have with Black children are just how to protect your emotional health when you're in situations and scenarios where the majority is just white. And I know a friend at CSUMB just said they did a program, and it was basically for Black women, like how to interact with white people just in your office setting. Like, don't talk too loud. They're gonna think you're too boisterous, like the Black women that got kicked off that wine train for being too loud. There are certain ways that you have to police your identity and become less Black so that you can be more acceptable, and assimilate, so you can be more acceptable to whiteness and white people.
As a gay man, I didn't produce any children, but I do work with the college chapter in NAACP, and so I'll kind of speak from that perspective. One thing that I would say is that, so when I'm working with Black activists, students, I like them to know that they're in a different situation than white activist students. We are treated by law enforcement completely differently. So some of the kind of conversations that I have to have is that they can't be just as willy-nilly and carefree about their activism out in public, because and especially if they're doing it in in a mixed group, because if it's a mixed group and 6 people are arrested and 2 of them are Black and the rest of them are white, chances are that the white folks are gonna endure that better. They're gonna have more resources and so forth. So I think so when someone said, like, in terms of allies, putting your lives on the line, there are times where we need our white folks to be much more upfront in some of these places. Now, don't get me wrong. There's Black Panthers. There's Black Lives Matter. There's all sorts of people who are much more forward and militant, but nevertheless, it's something that I think they need to be conscious of, that they're going to be treated differently in terms of their activism. So that's an important thing. And the other thing is, I think it's important for. I often hear people saying, remember that we're like 3% of the county. And so a lot of white activists, and I've said this many times, but a lot of white activists are always wondering where we're at, where we're at on their issues. And so if you want to have a relationship with us, we don't have a lot of activists to spare. So, so it's important to, like, if you want to understand us, you come to us. Like, you join the NAACP. Don't ask me to join your white organization, because I don't have enough activists. Like, the pressures on our community are much greater than other communities. So come support us if you have any chance of freeing us up so that we can work more in coalition together.
I have a question for the I guess, either of the educators on the, or people in women in education on the panel, but first I want to say that I thank you for all of your input about how you talk to your children and ideas on that sort of thing. My children are older now. I'm a mom of 3, and they're half black, half white. And I was ignorant back then to thinking, I had them young. I started at 19. But I didn't see back then a difference in color. It was just people, and that's kind of the way I've always been. So when my oldest daughter was young, I didn't know that was even something I needed to teach her, how to protect her emotions or how to interact with, people of other ethnicities. So thank you for that. My youngest daughter is now 15, and she's struggling in high school with being mixed. And she doesn't know who she fits in with. She's not black enough to be with the black kids, and there's only one other one on the campus. And she's not white, so she's not with the white kids. And the majority of the students there are Latino, and that's fine. So my question for the educators is, what's the most productive way, or what is the best way to go about approaching a teacher who is making comments to the class and then is allowing comments amongst the students that I think people here in this room would consider racist, but he doesn't. And he just simply is unaware, because I've had a conversation with him myself. And the school hasn't been super helpful. I've spoken with the counselor who is Latina, but they haven't been very helpful. So that's my question for anyone really who would like to answer.
Well, I've been in schools with teachers like that, and you're right, it's not easy. They'll oftentimes just deny it or say it was a joke or I didn't mean it. Your student's overly sensitive.
That's exactly what I said.
But I think what you have to be is the advocate for your child, and so however you can continue to have that conversation, ask to have a meeting with that teacher and the principal. Okay. And let them know that, this is happening, happened more than once, and it's not a safe space for my child, and it's not a safe space for any other child of color, or, any other child who might not speak up, because that's a tricky age. They're very reluctant, and especially, that's what I saw at the school. I'm not saying where I worked, you probably can just guess the 2 schools, but at the school that was primarily white, like I said, the kids of color kind of tried to hide and just blend in, because otherwise they're bringing up something that is emotional and
also
dangerous, possibly.
Excuse me, I want to just also talk, because even though I'm as old as I am, I helped to desegregate a school in Baltimore, and so I was one of the first group of black girls to go into this school, and we did keep a couple of my friends, my African American friends, were noisy in terms of their protests at the racism that we were hit with, but most of us kept quiet, and it really was a self-protective thing, because going through adolescence is hard enough, and then if you're in a school that's demanding academically, you've got that, and then you've got all the other kind of side issues, and bringing attention to yourself as someone who protests the way that you're being treated in a school brings attention, okay? So I really want to encourage you to listen to your daughter, and that if you are going to confront, and I think you should, I think you need to be her advocate, the principal and the teacher, that you write down what the person has said so that you have it as verbatim as possible, okay? So make sure that you got the words right, and then you can read back those words and say, when I hear this, this is what happens with me. This is what I think. This is what I think you're communicating. You see, so that you're feeding that person. I'd recommend that you not, that you dump your emotion before you go.
Yes, right.
Because that will cloud things, and you're really entitled to the emotion, but just take it out somewhere. Yeah, right. and then present it. And I think if you are consistent and you show up every single time that child says something, that something will shift. Either the teacher will become a problem for the principal because you're taking her time, or something will happen.
I think that's all really great advice. I think the only thing I would add is, I think it's anytime you're sort of pushing against an institution, it's always more effective if you have other people with you.
Yes.
So if there's a way to organize with other parents at the school who either because they also are parents of children of color, or because they're white parents who want their kids to go to a school that isn't, where we don't have racist teachers. And that's harder, right? How does an individual parent try to make folks come together? But to try to, I think that, or if there are maybe organizations that exist in the community that could be supportive, Families of Color Monterey County might be an idea. But it's the idea that you need to, it's always more powerful if you have more numbers behind you. And so it's not about
just at that school. It's not on the peninsula, but it is
Yeah.
in Monterey County.
Okay.
So I don't know any other parents of students that are dealing with the same thing.
Yeah.
My daughter is. I know people in the community that could certainly help, but I
Good.
don't know any
Take
other
them with
parents.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's great.
And to try to figure out a way to talk to other parents, because there is no doubt that if this is what your daughter's experiencing, other students are experiencing it as well.
I was just gonna say one other thing as a mom of two daughters who were not students of color, but who had a few issues, that you probably have already done this, but to make sure your daughter knows you're doing this and that the teacher would in no way implicate, because they don't want to bring attention to themselves, even if it's through their mom.
Yes.
But I had a few occasions where I said, I really feel like I need to intervene on your behalf. I'm letting you know that. I'm going to ask that they not, say that was how this happened. But I'm sure you know that. But
yes, I learned that.
I have one quick suggestion. One of the things I do in my practice is represent teachers through their union. And I would anticipate that if the district takes your complaint seriously, there will be a disciplinary response, which is the least productive of the responses that you could have with that teacher. So I'm not trying to talk you out of filing complaints or whatever you may need to do if they don't respond, but the point would be to try to change that behavior, not to discipline the teacher or get the district to issue a reprimand or something of that nature, because that disciplinary response is the same problem we have with students. And so to foster that with the teachers doesn't help either.
I would also suggest that on the website of Whites for Racial Equity, there could be resources for you to sustain and thinking about how to approach this. I think all the suggestions here were absolutely spot on, but in order to also support you personally in terms of your understanding of what might be going is to check out the website and look for resources.
I'm so sorry, we have to move along to
Can
our.
I just Jackie?
More, and then we have other people, and I noticed that they're starting to get up and leave, so I want to get to everyone's questions.
Okay, yeah.
Ms. Southern, do you want to have a person?
Oh, my question is, people of color. I'm not into this. I mean, what does this become? We're all colored because there's Mexican, there's black, there's someone. Is that the new label? We're all. I'm a black person. I'm from Korea. I'm from Louisiana.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm
The
proud
new
of
label.
that. Okay, I mean, I guess everybody else who in those particulars would be proud of that. So I'm wondering this.
Goes back to when we were used to be called colored.
Yes.
Long ago we were colored.
Yes.
And then
People
we were
of color.
Negro, and then we were Afro, and then we're African American,
Right.
and we're black, and we're people of color
Now
now.
it's back to people of color. That's what getting me. What is this?
Yes, and it's not implying that white is not a color, okay? I mean, it's not clear, but that's the label.
I mean, the way I would identify where it comes from, because I think there are people, who still identify as black or African American, but from I think about it in terms of women of color feminist movements. So it was a way, and obviously people of color in general, but for me particularly, I think about it very much in ways in which groups of women who were from racialized groups, like black women, Latina women who were not black, Native American women, Asian American women, wanted to see themselves in coalition with each other and understand while there were differences in their experiences, there were ways in which their experiences overlapped. And so they felt like person of color was a useful term to kind of put them into a coalitional category. And I think that still happens, right? That there are times when we say people of color because we want to talk about the fact that certain issues, for example, like policing and prisons impact Black communities and also non-Black Latino communities, right? So it can be a useful phrase. I also think sometimes it's really important to talk about Black experiences separately, to talk about Asian and experiences, Asian American experiences separately, etc. So I think it has its use value, right? I don't think we want to all be people of color all the time, but sometimes we need to be.
So thank you so much. I'm gonna crisscross to the other side of the room because it's getting empty. So I noticed you had your hand up a long time ago. Thank you for being so patient, and we're gonna pass it this way again, okay?
All right, thank you. My name is Ben Nurse. I'm part of the Village Project family, so thank you all for being up here. I like to focus on solutions, and I love the discussion that we're having, and I wanted to see from the panel if we can talk about kind of the small activities that all of us can do within our communities. Not just our communities, but in our workplaces, because we talked about, and Stephen mentioned it articulately, that the African American community, for instance, is only about 3% of the county. What that means is that the school district that we're talking about, the prison systems, and more or less all of the jobs, they're not going to see a lot of African American and for that matter, a lot of Latino people. So in your jobs, you're interacting with our African American kids, our Latino kids in the school systems, in the foster care systems, in the county behavioral health and so forth. So think about what you can do at your job to advocate for those kids and their families. What can you do in your workplace on a daily basis to be the voice that says, why don't we have more people of color at the table? So think about in your daily work, how can you do that? Not just in supporting the different organizations, but on a regular basis. If you don't have African American youth or Latino in your workplace, find out how you can get teen interns in your workplace or college interns in your workplace so that you can introduce them. Because for me, and Regina mentions it, economics is important, and we're talking about poverty in a lot of cases. So we have to figure out how to get people jobs, trained, and in the positions where they can make influence. So what can you do in your workplace to be that advocate because you have that equality mindset, that fairness mindset? How can you bring other people to the table in your own jobs? And I would love to hear the panel if they had any other comments on that.
Well, I did say I did just retire, but I did work in the school system on the peninsula for 25 years. And I think Ann said it pretty clearly, in schools at least, show them that you care, show them that you're welcoming. I was the librarian, and I had, students come to me when things would, be a struggle for them, and they knew I was a safe harbor in a way for a lot of students, not just students of color, not just African American, not just Latino, but sometimes that was the group that would, I would, attract because they knew I was an accepting person. I ran the NCBI diversity program, so immediately they could see that. And I would say that at both schools, that was the case, that oftentimes the kids who felt the most underrepresented, whether it was our gay students or African American students, especially if there were one or two, they looked for someone who was safe. And when they didn't see someone who reflected back, which would be ideal, how they look, then they look for someone who cares about them. And so I would say if you're in a school, that's probably, love your students and, love especially the students who maybe aren't getting full representation or full fair treatment in the institution.
I'll take a step. Go ahead. Well, I will say, let me say reparations. We often think about reparations, for slavery and things like that in terms of one day the government's going to do something for us, And I think people can take that. If you have resources, you can take that on as an individual. Sponsor a child for something. I mean, there are things that we can do as individuals and not waiting for the government to do. The other thing is we can be tithing our time in underrepresented communities, and I tend to think that whatever identities of privilege that you have, whether it's being male or whether it's being white or whether it's being heterosexual, then what is your counterpart group, and that is a group where you can that you could really serve by bringing your resources, your time, your volunteer time, your money, and take direction and join that group. You know, I also think that we need to, I would like for African Americans to integrate more than the city of Seaside and integrate the entire peninsula. We often hear that that we feel uncomfortable maybe in Carmel and Pebble Beach. Well, there should be opportunities for students from Salinas to take a field trip to Pebble Beach. So it's right. So it's not always just one person. You know. So we need to occupy the entire county and peninsula a lot more.
And just briefly, I think that we should also look at the industry here. What are the industries that are in Monterey County? How many people that are of African descent do they have? And look within our communities and see what are the age groups and encourage those young people to get educated so that they can go into these various and sundry fields, and make sure that we hold people accountable to hire people of African ancestry and other people of color in some of these jobs, because it's by design that they're not integrating any of the industries around here, because it's about economics. People are comfortable with their friends and their family members. There's a lot of nepotism, especially in the county. And so I think that really looking at it from a data-driven standpoint and then coming up with a strategy to address it.
I just wanted to really quickly respond. There's a new group, or I don't know if you want to call it an organization or a movement, but it's on Facebook and it's called Collectivized Monterey County. And it's very new, and it's put on by some students at CSUMB and MPC. And it is sort of like reparations, and it's a place for people of color to get their needs met outside of capitalism. So there's no currency, there's no money involved. It's, you know, I will give you a haircut or I'll give you a ride to your job interview if you can watch my kids tonight. So it's supposed to be a method of exchange, but white allies are welcome, not to trade with people of color, but to do offerings. So because it's not equal. So if you have the financial means, if you have the, you know, if you have a car, if you have, if you just have the means to help and support these communities, that's a good place for you to feel like you are directly impacting local residents and people of color.
So let me just say, I'm sorry. I'll just say one real quick thing. Some of you may remember Prop 209. Prop 209 is what made affirmative action illegal in California. So there is no such thing now as affirmative action in government. However, every government has an obligation to do outreach. And so one of the things that everybody can do is, with government agencies, look up the HR person, give him the name of him or her, the name of your organization, and ask that all job postings be sent to your organization, and then get the word out. Because the common thing I hear in my practice doing employment discrimination is, oh, we tried to find an African American candidate, but we couldn't find any qualified. So qualified people need to apply to these jobs.
So we're definitely over time, and we have people who have other commitments today later. So
could we do just
one more question? And then that's it, all right? Okay.
My question is addressed to Richard in the Dragon Slayer, which is that Anne and Stephen had talked about a white identity, and I look at genealogy as a way to deconstruct a false white identity, because we don't have an excuse if we look white to not know our heritage, because the genealogic records go back and trace that for us all the way off the continent. We can chase our ancestors off the continent, which is something that other brethren can't do. They don't have that right, so it's locked in our DNA sometimes, or it's on paper right in front of us. Ancestry.com, for example, is a great tool to help us dissemble our mindsets around identity and to shift incrementally and slowly but surely towards a more inclusive past that includes us as their heirs. And I would want to know if you guys can use that, and if that's a way to help white people shift their conscience.
Go on, Dragon Slayer.
I don't know. I haven't found much use in something like that. Maybe some people could. I know there are people who try to reclaim a kind of sense of like cultural and ethnic, white people trying to reclaim a cultural and ethnic identity that's before whiteness existed. Whiteness isn't like it's a historical thing, so like before whiteness, the people just had light skin, some people had darker skin, people lived wherever they lived and had different cultures and religion, whatever. So some people do that. I haven't personally found much use for it. I think I find more maybe what something that Quasar was saying about trying to find like kind of white anti-racist historical figures is probably more important for me. So like, and then there actually are people. There's a growing movement of like white working class anti-racist, anti-capitalist group called the Redneck Revolt, and they're organizing in largely rural and white communities to counter basically white supremacist recruiting. I think stuff like that is more powerful for me. There's also groups like the John Brown Brigades, which are organized anti-capitalist, anti-racist self-defense for protests and things, and calling back the history of John Brown, who sacrificed his life, to try to abolish slavery. So I think those things are very useful for me. But maybe people find I've vaguely heard people finding kind of a pre-settler white identity, European identity or something. But I find the historical kind of anti-racist, anti-capitalist radical figures to be more important. And also being able to identify with people of color who struggle too. I don't think we need to have I don't need to be like, oh, of course there were white people struggling, but like we can also celebrate other people too. And I think we should celebrate all people who struggle, especially the most marginalized. So I don't know. It could be useful, but it's not for me.
Not too much more. I mean, I know my ancestry is Jewish, and it's been, I'm pretty secure in that and understand that history and that connection. I think that working with NCBI and working in high schools, asking the white young people to talk about what they're proud of was difficult for them. And I think that one of the ways to counter that is to find out from your family where you're from. And there were people and young kids who would say, I don't know where my family came from. Their families of origin are not talking about it. So it's the encouragement to remember that, to find that, and identify with that, because that's what ends the supremacy, is to have your own identity.
So that wraps things up for us here. And we thank you all for hanging in there. So we'll see you next time on the next episode of CSUMB Women's March.
Very good.
Good job.
That's part of this.
I wanted to touch your soft hands again.
Hello. How are you? Huh? What?
I'm an old NCBI person, and I want to get back into regular group meetings. And so, of course, I emailed Sue, but you're in charge of us, right?
No, Sue is still, Elena is actually the president of the community, of the Monterey community, who is sitting here. And I'm Regina.